Well, thanks very much, Satu, and thanks to the East-West Center for hosting this afternoon. I'm a little bit stunned at how many people are in this room, and a lot of friendly faces. I also really have to say a particular word of thanks to Professor Womack, who has stuck with me and this project for over a decade now, and it really would not have happened without his support. Just a quick word of clarification before I start, that the book really was something that I wrote originally as my doctoral dissertation and finished before arriving at Human Rights Watch. So it's very much mine and not Human Rights Watch's, but I'm happy to try to make a connection between the findings of the book and what I think the implications are with respect to human rights protections, particularly in places like Cambodia. I thought maybe a quick word on why I wrote this book, or what drove it. I lived, as some of you know, I lived in Cambodia in the mid-1990s, which was a time when people, particularly in Asia and latterly in other parts of the world, started to talk about China's rise and whether that was a good thing or a bad thing or what to make of it. And at that point, I had spent several years living in Cambodia, and I had a little bit of trouble understanding why, given that what China was trying to do in Cambodia at the time, or at least some of it, seemed quite similar to what many other donors were doing, building wells, building roads, things like that, why that was considered particularly problematic. I was also working for an organization that did democracy promotion programs, which were incredibly well-intentioned, and we certainly tried. But we were certainly up against much larger forces than I think what we were able to successfully fight back against. And I think that raised some questions in my mind about whether some of the principles that underscored Western foreign policy were really as effective as one might want, particularly when you held them up in comparison to what the Chinese government was doing. A couple of other questions occurred to me at the time that if you went to Cambodia at the time and you talked about China, what people would immediately ask you about was the Khmer Rouge and the connection there. And I couldn't help but wonder, if the Cambodian connection to China was so much about the Khmer Rouge and this incredibly traumatic, awful part of the past, why on earth would Cambodians or Chinese really seek to draw attention to a relationship? Why would that be sort of pushed out for the rest of the world to observe again? And then thirdly, at the end of the day, why would a country like China at that point, really on the rise, focused very much on economic development at home and other, I think probably more pressing global priorities, care about a country like Cambodia? Why would it bother with a country that was so underdeveloped, that had gone through such incredible political distress, where it had such a bad reputation? What on earth would prompt that? And the more I started to look historically into the relationship between the two countries, there were a couple of remarkable I think, historical anomalies that jumped out at me. One was certainly Beijing's enduring support for monarchy. And not just for monarchy, but particularly for a monarch, not necessarily for the communists. The first meetings between Chinese leaders and King Sihanouk took place in the early 1950s, and to this day continue to be quite deeply held. It's a really sort of remarkable and unpredictable aspect of the relationship. Second of all, that the Chinese government helped not once but twice establish and maintain exile Cambodian governments in Beijing. Now, if you think about the potential, comparisons to Taiwan or Tibet, it's really quite astonishing. China is not the place most people go to set up an exile government, and yet, for those of you who are familiar with Beijing and the Friendship Hotel, which was a very popular place for diplomats to stay, the part of it that is now a TGI Fridays is actually the suite that hosted the Khmer Rouge offices, or sorry, not the Khmer Rouge, the early 70s coalition government. This is not sort of a natural thing for the Chinese government to do. I think it's also worth pointing out that since the UNTAC era, post-1993 Cambodia, that the Chinese government has engaged fairly consistently with a government that continues to be dominated by the people who were once its enemies. We have to bear in mind that in the late 1970s and through the 1980s, the relationship between China and Vietnam was terrible, and that the people who were running Cambodia then and who continue to run Cambodia today were essentially proxies of the Vietnamese. And yet, Now there's a perfectly functional relationship. So I think my sense was that there was a lot more there than met the eye and didn't fit into sort of a standard explanation of affinity between communist or Marxist political parties, even necessarily of regional alliances. And after several years of doing archival research in a couple of different places and more than 100 interviews with current and retired Chinese diplomats, essentially asking them what choices they had made, both generally about certain foreign policy decisions and about Cambodia in particular, I came to the conclusion that some of that funny rhetoric you often hear out of the Chinese government about things like non-interference, non-aggression, actually meant something. Those weren't just terms that they tossed around. They actually set limits on certain policy choices. And so what I'd like to do is explain a little bit about what those what the principles actually are and what I think they actually mean in reality. To me, this was an interesting contribution as an academic exercise because it falls wildly outside of what at least most American or European international relations theory would have you believe, particularly about a country like China. So just a quick word on that very antiquated sounding rhetoric and how it translates into reality. The idea of peaceful coexistence itself essentially says, we don't care how big you are, we don't care what type of regime you have, we don't care if you're a monarchy, we don't care if you're religious, we take you as you are, okay? It didn't matter to the Chinese government what kind of regimes countries had, which is very different from how the US or European countries either formulate or carry out their bilateral relationships. And so in that sense, it never mattered that Cambodia was a monarchy, that it was Buddhist, or that it was, or frankly, that it was small or underdeveloped. That just really wasn't an issue in the calculations. The idea of mutual respect for territorial integrity and sovereignty is very much about regaining control of territories that the Chinese government considers to be its. And this is very much about places like Taiwan, Tibet, Xinjiang, Macau, tick on down the list. And in that sense, if Sihanouk got nothing else right in terms of his relationship with the Chinese government, his very early support and very public support for the One China policy and for China and for the PRC regaining the Chinese seat at the UN made an enormous difference. To this day, you will hear people in Beijing talk about that particular decision on Sihanouk's part. The idea of non-aggression is reasonably straightforward. It essentially means that unless the Chinese government considers that part of its territory has been attacked, it will not pursue aggressive policies towards others. And obviously with Cambodia, this was never particularly a problem. Non-interference in international affairs, or in internal affairs. I think this is sometimes interpreted partly as a matter of diplomatic niceties that, you sort of stay on your side of the line, I stay on mine. But it's more complicated than that. I think there's a real belief amongst a lot of Chinese foreign policymakers that external interference or involvement in other countries generally has negative effects, not positive ones. That people who are not of a place can't possibly have superior knowledge about how it functions or what would be helpful. There are many ways in which this can be problematic because we see sometimes China doesn't intervene in situations where I think we could reasonably assume it would have a positive effect, and the unilateral view is that that's just not appropriate. But I think this goes a long way towards explaining, among other things, why Beijing, fully aware of what was going on in Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge, didn't change course. I think I interviewed a number of people who had served in Phnom Penh or in Bangkok at the time, and many of them really did believe that there wasn't anything they could do to make it less awful. And we could have a long conversation about whether we all think that's true, but the key here is that that's what they thought. I think there are circumstances under which this belief becomes a very convenient way of saying, stay out of our business inside China, which is one of the many issues that's problematic for human rights implications. But as far as foreign policy is concerned, this is a very important issue and also explains no strings attached aid. Just the idea that it is up to the government of the recipient country to do what it thinks is best with the funds that have been given. A quick word on how I think some of these policies translate a little bit more into practical terms around the world, or sort of globally. That you're likely to see the PRC establish and maintain relations with countries regardless of state size, regime type, or even how a particular government came to power. I will bet anyone in this room $20 that no matter who wins the Burmese elections, you will see a statement within 48 hours from the Chinese government welcoming that, whoever it is. Whatever happens over the next couple of weeks in Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan, you will see the Chinese government say, we're fine with that. It's just not, it's not up for debate. It really isn't. I would expect to see Chinese objections to anything, particularly inside China, that looks like it might support regime change. I mean, we see fairly hostile responses. Where's Louisa? We see fairly hostile responses to anything that sort of smacks of color revolutions or any sort of internal change, relationships with NGOs that suggest greater political freedoms. There's a real allergic reaction to anything like that, again, because it violates the idea of non-interference and occasionally crosses the line into, I think, the Chinese definition of aggression, which triggers a whole separate response, I think. The world really wants China to take a side in certain kinds of debates. Carrie Brown of Chatham House had a terrific piece in the IHT a couple of weeks ago asking or saying, China, you have to tell us what you want. Tell us which side you're on. And I think the belief in Beijing is really that it's not about taking sides, that to take a side would be antithetical to their own interests and how they look out at the world. At the same time, I wouldn't suggest that that means the Chinese government takes the world as it is unquestioningly and doesn't have relationships with multiple actors inside certain countries. There was a certain amount of consternation or maybe it was optimism that, for example, the Chinese government had been meeting with various Burmese opposition groups in Yunnan. This was last summer, about a year ago. I think that's fairly normal, just because they're going to maintain a very clear relationship with a government in power doesn't mean that they're not going to know who the other players are. And in fact, there's a long story to be told about the initial contact between the Chinese government and the members of the fledgling Khmer Rouge, and how that sort of came to pass, because it was very much a relationship initially between people who went on to form the core of the Gang of Four. It was very much about uncertainty in Beijing and who was establishing relationships with whom and how they developed. A word quickly on the circumstances under which the principles, I think, can't be expected to apply, where these things really become fairly negotiable. Anything that Beijing perceives to be a threat to its territorial integrity or its sovereignty, and typically this is with respect to places like Tibet and Taiwan, where you hear very aggressive rhetoric, you see descriptions about PLA mobilizations, you get a much, much, much more hostile response. And it's particularly this issue, I think, that complicates the relationship with the United States. The U.S.'s long relationship with Taiwan obviously puts it in a permanent category of suspicion for Beijing, and that until that issue is resolved, I think we're never going to see a really uniformly happy relationship. And I think the principles did not necessarily hold up very well when you saw really significant political shifts inside China. And this was particularly true in the early 70s and then again in the late 70s at sort of the peak and then the close of the Cultural Revolution. A very quick word on what the consequences of the 5 principles are for international human rights protection. This is a fairly short section. It's most human rights interventions are needed because sovereign governments are either failing to protect their own people from human rights abuses, or because governments are themselves perpetrating the abuses. They are almost always matters that relate intimately to a sovereign government. And given the Chinese government's insistence that that is a concept that is only to be negotiable under the most extreme circumstances, it's very difficult to envision greater Chinese support for certain kinds of human rights interventions. One of the more interesting developments I've followed in the last couple of years has to do with a concept called the responsibility to protect, which essentially obliges governments all over the world to intervene when human rights crises reach a certain magnitude. And the Chinese government was initially extremely skeptical about this idea and really only signed on to it at a stage when the discussion was still very abstract and stuck at a procedural level at the United Nations in New York, from which anything, very little ever emerges intact. But as this idea sort of garners a certain amount of traction and becomes a little bit more of a reality, we can see the Chinese government kind of backing away from it and trying very hard to qualify or narrow the scope of the discussion. The Chinese government, I think as a result of these ideas about sovereignty and some of the other principles, the Chinese government just doesn't subscribe to or think as useful certain kinds of diplomatic practices that are often pivotal to human rights protections, sanctions, backburnering relations with governments that are being abusive, even a belief that foreigners should be able to intervene or be part of a discussion about a human rights crisis. These are all ideas that the Chinese government simply really doesn't subscribe to, and it makes it very difficult to get support for things like arms embargoes or even resolutions on human rights crises like Burma at the Security Council. The Chinese government just doesn't believe in those particular ideas. The last one I would point to is that the sort of paradox that the Chinese government has signed now and ratified most of the core international human rights instruments, which oblige it to do certain things, including bringing certain domestic laws into conformity with what those, with what those ideas mean in terms of policy, and it simply doesn't follow through on most of those. There's now a very lively debate about why China signed these covenants, given that its practices are so different. There's one view that says they didn't really understand what was at stake. I have a little trouble believing that. But I think there's a highly selective interpretation about how those rights matters. And what we've seen the Chinese government do is, in fact, use certain parts of certain covenants to justify their own interpretation that things like civil and political rights have to come after a certain level of development and to try to garner support for that view. I think the way in which the Chinese government is unhelpful on human rights protections that I encounter most frequently in my daily life at Human Rights Watch is a real pushback against certain norms and certain institutions. We've seen the Chinese government, I think, really pervert the spirit, if not the process, of things like the Universal Periodic Review, which is the new process within the UN's Human Rights Council by which all member states' human rights records get reviewed every 4 years. I'm happy to go into more detail about that if anybody would like to. Objecting to putting real crises on the Security Council's agenda, or even really, furthering debates about how norms set out in the UN should be translated into policy. And part of this is because the Chinese government wasn't part of the UN when these norms were determined and really enshrined. But it becomes very difficult to get other governments to act when they know the Chinese government isn't going to. Lest I be entirely negative, I do want to point out a few ways in which I think the Chinese government has become more positive as a result of some of these principles. For the international activities or efforts that fall within the confines of the 5 principles, I think we see a little bit more enthusiasm for things like peacekeeping operations. China is now a significant contributor, and now that its comfort level with the idea of sovereignty and how it's maintained or not violated through those kinds of activities has risen. A little bit more enthusiasm for certain kinds of coordinated diplomatic action of the kind, for example, that we saw last year around piracy in Somalia. A tiny, tiny bit of willingness to talk more about things like targeted banking sanctions. It's been a long, slow discussion, but there was some support last year for banking sanctions against particular individuals in North Korea. I want to close just by talking very quickly about the event that's described in the flyer for this event, the forced return of about 20 Uighurs to China from Phnom Penh in December of 2009. These were people who had left China seeking asylum in Cambodia. They were, at least about half of the men in the group were alleged to have been involved in the protests in Xinjiang in July of 2009 and had been deemed by the Chinese government, simply by virtue of having left the country without permission, to be criminals. They had actually made it to Phnom Penh. They had made it to the Office of the High Commissioner for Refugees. They had been given persons of concern letters, which is the agency's way of saying, we agree that you deserve to have a hearing about whether you get to claim asylum. And the Chinese government wanted them back. They wanted them back, I think, not just because I don't think they really thought they were criminals, but I think it was an embarrassment. It was a very public event. And despite some fairly strenuous interventions by the U.S. and others, sort of at the 11th hour, the Cambodian government did send them back. We have no idea what's happened to those people. We have some information to suggest that several of them have been charged and sentenced. We have no idea what happened to the 2 children who were in the group. One was about 6 months old at the time. The other one was about 10 months old. But I think part of the reason this happened, and this was I think an unusually aggressive and ugly gesture, an incident by the Chinese government. But again, it touched on sovereignty. It touched on issues of interference. It touched on an issue that they thought was theirs to deal with and theirs alone, and they weren't having it any other way. But I think part of the reason it unfolded the way it did was because the U.S., the UN, others didn't understand what was at stake, and they didn't know what to predict. They made the wrong call, and they lost out. And I think as the world tries to figure out how to keep protecting certain kinds of human rights and to engage the Chinese government on issues where it can be engaged, but also prepare to push back against them on issues where it disagrees, there has to be a lot more understanding of what it is Beijing wants, why it wants it, and how it's going to go about getting it. I'm going to stop there.
Thank you very much. That's terrific. Professor Womack, all yours.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be here. It's been a pleasure to work with Sophie for the whole 10 years of the book, and I'm sure that I'm just as happy as you are to see it out in print and beginning to be read, and I'm sure that the audience for the book and for the ideas that you present will continue to grow. And so let me start with 3 areas where I think this book makes a major contribution, and then I'll go into some reflections on areas where I think the book can stimulate further thoughts beyond the scope of the research itself. The first thing I want to say about the book is that it is a compelling narrative of the relations between Cambodia and China since the 1950s. And I mean, it's compelling both as a good read and as research. Before this session, I was rereading the book. I was going to just check on some points, in the book. I wasn't planning to reread the whole book. But I started reading, and it's a page turner. It's a really good narrative of a really interesting, complex situation where various alternatives are there, where the actors are facing very complex decisions. It really makes vivid a situation and an interaction that for some of us may ring ancient bells of resonance from the times and ring them a lot more clearly than they rang at the time. And for some others of us will present a very important facet of the development of not just Cambodia and not just Chinese foreign relations, but Southeast Asia in general over the last 50 years. And it is compelling as research. I think that this is in my opinion, since Nyan Chanda's Brother Enemy, which is a real classic. And if you're interested in Southeast Asia and haven't read Brother Enemy, correct your mistake. Okay, but don't make the same mistake with Sophie's book. Don't wait so long. This book is founded on an amazing level of first-hand research, not just published materials, archives, and many, many interviews that really present a convincing and integrated account of this very complex development. And so this is a book that is essential reading, obviously, for Cambodia, to understand Cambodia today and its past developments. It's also essential for Chinese foreign policy, because unless we simply identify Chinese foreign policy as China-U.S. relations, which would be a bad mistake, then the relationships with countries like Cambodia provide an essential third-party perspective, an essential contextualization of Chinese overall foreign policy and its principles. And it provides essential reading for the U.S. war in Southeast Asia, both the contrast between China's behavior toward Cambodia and our behavior toward Cambodia, and in general, a note about the war not simply being between communism in the West, but between other ideas as well. And one of the ideas on the Chinese side was the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. And then lastly, it's essential reading for understanding Southeast Asia after our war. There's still too much of a tendency to look, when we hear the word Vietnam, to think that it's a war rather than a country. And there's a tendency to ignore Southeast Asia, despite very promising declarations by the current administration to get re-involved. But to get re-involved and not understand the Southeast Asian situation is not to be re-involved. The Southeast Asia is not awaiting for the clouds to roll back and the sunshine of U.S. interest to restore. It has to be a serious interest in what's been happening there, what the perspectives are. And part of Southeast Asia's situation is being neighbor to China. So that's the first thing I find really remarkable about the book. The second thing is that it is an eloquent argument to take seriously China's self-conception of its foreign policy principles. There's a phrase that Sophie uses that really caught my attention. That is that the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence were a rolling back of the normative legacy of imperialism. I read that, I sat back and thought, wow, the normative legacy of imperialism. There's a thought. How much of that legacy remains? How much are we still carrying the white man's burden? How much of our attitudes toward the rest of the world and the U.S. responsibilities and obligations toward the rest of the world are based on an implicit superiority, an implicit judgment that those countries cannot handle things themselves, and therefore we, by right of what, should step in? And the idea of 5 principles of peaceful coexistence being originating, first of all, in China, the revolutionary China's situation of international weakness and the effects of Western imperialism and Japanese imperialism on China. A sense that countries can be at the wrong end of other countries' interests, and that their interests need to be protected, and that the autonomy of their political communities has to be a principle, a fundamental principle of foreign policy. This, I think, is something that, as Sophie demonstrates, was a very important and leading aspect of China's policy toward Cambodia, but also the contrast between that mentality and the mentality of what might be called invasive responsibility is quite different. And then the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, as Sophie referred to in her remarks, and also she covers in the final chapter of the book, had very contrasting effects on U.S.-China relations and on relations between China and smaller countries. For the U.S., it was a complicating situation where the policy, our relations with China continued to be, or we continue to be criticized in that relationship on the basis of principles that we either didn't take seriously, didn't understand, or didn't feel were appropriate for the relationship. For smaller countries, we were not, at the time, I don't know if this has changed, we're not vulnerable to China, okay? But smaller countries, Cambodia, Vietnam, Myanmar, whatever, other countries, they appreciated the willingness to hold back from interference in internal affairs and other things. So there's a differential effect. If China's on the small end of the stick with the United States, then 5 principles of peaceful coexistence is a defensive policy in the relationship, and a policy that's not necessarily welcomed by the partner. But if China's on the large end of a relationship with other countries, then those countries feel some protection, some acknowledgement of their interest in those relationships. So I think the book really does an excellent job and a long-needed job of focusing on the importance of those principles for countries that felt vulnerable. And few countries felt more vulnerable, not just from China, but from the whole regional situation than Cambodia from the 50s on. A last area where I think the book makes a serious contribution is it's an important analysis of China's foreign policy practice, especially with regards to neighbors and smaller states. The importance of ritual, the importance of Prince Sihanouk's never-ending and constant messages to China and the publicity they were given there, and the good treatment of Sihanouk when he visited China and lived there. Americans are not ritual conscious by nature. And as a Texan myself, I'm even less ritual conscious than the average American. Okay, but the book demonstrates, without pointing too much direct attention at it, the book demonstrates the importance of that, of the way ritual creates a sleeve of normalcy in a relationship between a large and a small country. That the ritual, the respect for the head of state, the respect, the routine, not summit conference grand card game of deliverables, but that routine of recognition is extremely important for the smaller country in a relationship between countries of different capacities. And also another aspect is the importance of relationships rather than simply the current crisis of the moment. And in the case of Cambodia, it was not simply a relationship of state to state that had to be maintained in its continuity, but also very much of a person and of people. Prince Sihanouk and his continuity in Cambodian politics was an essential factor in the story that Sophie tells. And it's not just that China felt that Sihanouk was a reliable partner in the sense of being a client. It was that Sihanouk was a respected partner. And therefore, when Sihanouk decided to do things differently from China's policy, for instance, when he quit the coalition government of Democratic Kampuchea and negotiated with Hun Sen, which is certainly not China's policy at the time, China still respected him. China still maintained its policy. That's a very important dimension of the story. So China certainly expressed its preferences in the Cambodia-China relationship over time, but it didn't usually enforce those preferences on Cambodia as a client. It didn't try to just bracket the Cultural Revolution period, but it didn't usually try to subordinate Cambodian interests to China's foreign policy interests. It respected the Cambodian position despite having preferences of how it wanted Cambodia and especially Prince Sihanouk to act. So those three things, the compelling narrative, the taking seriously China's self-conception as a foreign policy actor, and the analysis of foreign policy practice are three things that I think make this a must-read. Now, let me go on to some further thoughts. And the first further thought that I have is that this narrative could be put in a very interesting contrapuntal narrative with China's relations with Vietnam during the same period. It's not a counter-narrative, but it is something where the starting point, the foreign policy aims, and the foreign policy outcomes are quite different between the China-Vietnam and China-Cambodia. You have Vietnam and China had an identity, a feeling of common suffering from Western imperialism throughout the 20th century. Ho Chi Minh taught Rural Revolution in China, wrote his poetry in Chinese. The Chinese were very much involved. For the first country to recognize Vietnam in 1950, they were very intimately involved and felt an intimate identity with the Vietnamese Revolution. You had in this identity of oppression within this situation of oppression with Vietnam, and you have that versus the situation Sophie describes. Cambodia wasn't discovered by China until the Geneva Conference. You know, Zhou Enlai was caught by surprise. There's a real country out there. It isn't just part of Indochina, you know, and it doesn't want to be a part of Greater Vietnam in some future situation. So you have Cambodia enters as a place, as a state that needs autonomy. For the relationship between China and Vietnam is and has always been a party-to-party relationship primarily, not so much a state-to-state relationship. And in fact, the structure of China's foreign ministry and the International Committee of the Central Committee bears that out. So you have party revolution supported in Vietnam versus this state mutual respect in Cambodia. They're not contradictory, but they're very different. You have Vietnam as the chief battleground of the war with the United States in Southeast Asia. You have Cambodia's role as the ambiguous boundary of the war. You know, as the sidelines that might jump to one side or the other, or the war might be extended, etc., over that period of time. You have, in the personality realm, you have Sihanouk and the Chinese relation with Sihanouk versus the Chinese relation with Le Duc after the death of Ho Chi Minh. And Le Duc was a hard person to live with, whether you were Vietnamese or Chinese. And that was a very different personality situation, and one could play with different hypothetical situations of what would have happened if Sihanouk had died in 1970. You know, if there hadn't been that personal thread of continuity in the diplomatic relationship. You have the merging of Chinese policies toward Vietnam and Cambodia as a result of Vietnamese occupation, 79 to 91, or 79 to 89, really. And then the reemergence of separate policies after 1991. And as Sophie pointed out, the people that, as Cambodia was recognized as autonomous again, and China established its relationships under the UN auspices, it was with and in support of the government figures that Vietnam had put there. Hun Sen, people like that. So you have a very interesting, almost abrupt change in China's relationships within Cambodian politics, but an application of principles that were in continuity. So that's one important, one area where I think it's where Sophie contributes a narrative that could be put into a larger framework. A second thing that strikes me as important is that what she says about 5 principles and describes in the case of Cambodia is certainly under some challenge in this current era of China, not only the peaceful rise of China, but you might say since 2008, the peaceful leap forward of China. You have a situation where the relative situation of China, over the last 10 years especially, the global presence of China has increased in the last 2 years, and arguably in the foreseeable future, China's relative improvement of economic situations and level of economic accomplishment will be even more impressive. And therefore, the question is, how does this change its relationships with neighbors like Cambodia? This era of global economic uncertainty, how does that affect things? I think that what we see in Southeast Asia and other places is an increasing concern and caution about the future, including the future relationships with China. It's not due to a particular policy on China's part. It's due to an awareness of a current and increasing dependency on relationships with China. And I'm not sure if China's current policy of win-win is enough to deal with that problem. Because win-win is important. Win-win is a much better policy in foreign relations than win-lose. Okay. But win-win implies that both sides are not only benefiting, but that both sides are taking equal risk. With China and its relations with Cambodia or with Vietnam or with Indonesia or wherever, China is taking an increasingly smaller risk in those relationships. It's increasingly less exposed to whatever the vulnerabilities of the relationship are. And as a result, its partners are going to be more cautious. Its partners are going to be more concerned about how that relationship with China is affecting their future options. And this does not mean that there's a contradiction in the interests. It doesn't mean that it's becoming win-lose. It does mean that China, in order to deal with this situation, as the asymmetry between China and its neighbors grows ever larger, China is going to have to pay more attention to its own patience, more attention to reassurance of those neighbors that the increasing relationship is not threatening. And that's a very reasonable thing for me to say, perhaps, but it may seem less urgent to China as it becomes a stronger power and as its focus changes from being a regional focus to a global focus. So if China becomes arrogant or self-satisfied in its relationships, as it does things like the example Sophie just raised of the return of the Uighurs, that has reverberations through other countries. So what do we do with people, personae non gratae? What do we do with, how vulnerable are our domestic politics, how vulnerable are our foreign relations to what appear to be unilateral demands of China, springing from China's domestic interests rather than from mutual benefit. So these will be concerns in the future. And the second aspect of the problems created by the peaceful leap forward and China's new status are questions also suggested by Sophie. What are the legitimate responsibilities of power? It's easy to condemn imperialism and the white man's burden and mission civilisatrice and all that, but certainly power, certainly a greater share of the world's resources and capacities implies certain responsibilities toward the world as a community. And that requires rethinking on China's part. It doesn't simply require it to adapt to American or European preferences. Has over the last 20 years, has our Iran policy been right and China's wrong? China's policy been right and ours wrong, or something in between, to just give an example. It doesn't require that type of adaptation, but it is certainly something where respect in a situation of global power has to be something more than indifference. And if respect of other countries does not mean indifference to their internal situations, what does it mean? And how do you implement that? And what's the functioning of that? It has to be beyond bilateral relationships, and certainly beyond bilateral relationships of I'm okay, you're okay. And participation in the UN peacekeeping forces is a good step in that direction. The questions of how to deal with problematic neighbors like Myanmar and North Korea are other things that have not just practical consequences, but normative consequences and normative challenges for China. The last reflection that I'd like to raise are, what are the implications for us? And these, of course, always of the greatest interest, right? And I'd say, first of all, we're in this situation of decreasing asymmetry with China. The World Bank just today came out with an estimate of China's economic growth to 2020, and they pointed out that by 2020, China should reach 1/4 of U.S. GDP per capita purchasing power parity by 2020. And that put China at the GDP per capita levels of Malaysia or Turkey. Now, World Bank is a very gentle organization, and they didn't also point out that with 4 times our population, that means that their estimate now is that China is reaching the U.S. GDP in 2020. Okay. So this raises the specter of parity. Okay, what happens? Sure, China's been good guy so far, but what happens when it reaches that point? And here I think that Sophie's research gives us very good news, because she points out, and the general conclusion would have to be that China's 5 principles of peaceful coexistence and other policies, peaceful cooperation, various other things since that initial formulation, are not simply derivative from its global power deficit. The reasons for 5 principles of peaceful coexistence being part of the China-Cambodia relationship weren't simply because China wasn't as powerful as X or Y or the United States. It was a matter of principle. And that matter of principle was successful, and so it's less likely to change in a situation of parity. The bad news, at least for some people, is that if China maintains and increases the solidity of its relationships with neighbors and other countries, then containment as an alternative for U.S. policy is not likely to work. After all, if we look back at the Soviet Union, at Stalin contained himself by Stanofian measures to control Eastern Europe. He scared Western Europe. Who built the Berlin Wall? Who kept their citizens from traveling abroad? And which of these things applies to China today? 0. So that option of containment is not there. It has to be an option of some sort of cooperation. And then the last point is lessons from Chinese diplomacy. The type of diplomacy, not Chinese side of U.S.-China relations, but Chinese diplomacy towards smaller countries. Because we're in a situation of asymmetric relationships with the whole rest of the world. So lessons about how to manage those relationships, I think, exist in the case that Sophie so beautifully presents. I think the basic lesson is that international relationships are best managed on the principle of mutual respect. I think that's the thing that caught Sihanouk's attention. It wasn't simply the personal chemistry between him and Zhou Enlai. It was that Zhou Enlai immediately adjusted to the need for Cambodia to be respected as an autonomous nation. And that was what he was not getting from elsewhere. And this mutual respect is necessary, I could say, even when relations are asymmetric, but better than that, especially when relations are asymmetric. And contrast that to our treatment of relations with Russia in the 1990s. As soon as Russia became powerless, our interest in Russia declined. Our interest in Russia's positions declined. It's very easy to treat countries according to their relative power rather than according to their interests and according to their concerns about their autonomy and their interests and their boundaries in dealing with the larger power. The stronger power cannot simply force its will. This should be our lesson from Cambodia as well as from Vietnam. The Chinese lesson is that there's a field of cooperation available between states of different sizes that does not reduce to aid dependency or to domination. And I think this is perhaps the most powerful lesson of the best parts of the China-Cambodian relations. Thank you.
Thank you very much.